He has taught in various institutions in the Boston area and also in Philadelphia. And it's a great honor to have him here. I'm just thrilled that he was able to come. It's going to lift us all to some new level of understanding. So welcome, and go ahead and speak at your leisure.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for having me here. Can you hear me all right? Okay. You were going to introduce a theme.
The theme?
Yes.
Right. Okay. Well, as you see on your sheets, we have the three major heroes. We have Odysseus, we have Theseus, and who's our third? Achilles. He's the least familiar of the three to me. At any rate, the method of interpretation that we're going to use, I talked to you yesterday about it. Does anybody remember the concept of the shadow? We talked about the shadow. And it's written there on your sheet. If you look at the second paragraph, it basically means the shadow can be either the shadow of a person, it could be your shadow, it can also be the shadow of any collective of which you're a part. So the shadow is the part of you or of your group that is unknown or unexamined or unfulfilled. You know, suppose you have an intention to become a great basketball player, and you're only one year into that intention. The shadow is all of the unfulfilled part. It's the part that's not yet realized. And the theme that we're working with is that the heroes are people who deal in shadows. But they don't just deal in their own personal shadow. They deal in the shadows of whole cities or whole cultures. And the journeys of some of the heroes, especially, say, Theseus, are trying to deal with parts of a whole city that haven't been answered. Like in our own culture, someone who dealt with the problem of, I don't know, maybe the fossil fuel crisis, and they found a solution to that. So people who make tremendous contributions to a culture have a heroic aspect, and that what makes them heroic is that they're dealing with something that most people don't want to deal with or can't deal with, or the whole culture can't deal with it, but they find a way to find answers.
All right. So the theme for today is the hero's journey. So that's the basic archetypal theme. So archetype, arche, is the Greek for root, and type just means root type. Root here also means universal. So archetypes is a major concept in Jungian psychology, and I want to introduce some of those ideas today. Can you write Jung on the board, J-U-N-G? So is it on the sheets? So you know how to spell Jung, right? Joseph Campbell talks about the hero's journey in 3 stages. Top right is departure. So the Arthurian knight leaves the court, goes off into the forest, and usually is obliged to go into the forest where there's no path, where nobody's been before. This relates to the idea of socialization and self-actualization. So one of the ideas we're talking about today is that you have to be a hero. The function of hero stories, and every culture throughout history has hero stories. And the hero story is to act as a kind of mirror and an inspiration for the heroic adventure of being an authentic human being. That's not necessarily easy, especially to actualize your uniqueness, your gifts, your talents. That's part of the hero's journey. And then initiation that's the I, D for departure, I for initiation, R for return. So these are the 3 archetypal stages of the hero's journey according to Joseph Campbell. the great American mythologist of the 80s and 90s. So the hero departs, encounters dragons, monsters, whatever, has to be battled, tested. If he survives, they don't always do, but the heroes that we remember do. The hero learns something from that and then returns to the tribe, the city, their culture, to offer a new way of being in the world. In other words, the hero's journey is rewarded with some insight or gift that the hero brings back to that culture to lift it into a higher quality kind of experience for everybody. And the culture isn't always necessarily receptive to that. And Jesus was crucified, Mahatma Gandhi was killed, Martin Luther King was killed. The culture isn't always necessarily ready to evolve, to self-actualize, to grow up, to follow the hero's journey. But the function of the hero myth is for each of us as individuals to have the courage to break away from what's called socialization. Socialization, another word for that is acculturation. They're synonymous. It just means being trained by your parents, school, churches, by your society to think a certain way, believe a certain way, behave a certain way. So you fit in with the tribe. The hero part is to have the courage not to simply do what everybody else does, but, as Shakespeare would say, to thine own self be true. And how can you be true to yourself if you have never gone inward and departed from the tribe and discovered who you are? So the hero's journey is a process of self-discovery and breaking away from the tribe, from society, and the normal modes of behavior and belief that define the society that they have been socialized into. But the courage to break away from that, that's the self-actualization journey. And so that's really, the ultimate theme for today is self-actualization. I challenge you. I have no doubt that Carl, in his own various ways, week after week, is challenging you to be true to yourself. And to be true to yourself is to actualize your unique, precious talents and gifts. And as you actualize, as you discover them, passionately commit to actualizing them, then that's the gift that you bring to the culture, so that the culture can evolve and grow to a higher quality, as you have done. So that's the function of the hero myth. So let's start with Theseus. And anytime you want to interrupt or take over, I mean, feel free. I don't mean to hog it here, but I think maybe this will get us started in a good way for the rest of the class, all right? And if you have any questions or want me to repeat anything, just shout it out, okay? It's okay to interrupt, because I want you to understand, obviously, and be clear. So I'm going to see if I can get all the way to the board here. All right. Okay, so a quick sketch of the Jungian map or model of the psyche I've put on the board. The ego, which is a term that Freud and Jung and most psychologists use, is your consciousness, your awareness, and the center of your sense of identity. When you say, I think, I believe, I want, that's your ego speaking. It's just another psychological term for the I, not E-Y-E, the I, right?
Everyone in this room knows that word because we all learned Latin.
Great.
That is the Latin word for I.
Great.
It's used by the psychologists this way.
Okay, fabulous. So we're going to put the ego right here in the head, and you might remember in the Iliad especially, but also in the Odyssey, it's not so much the head, it's the center is here in the thumos, in the spleen chakra area, the heart. You know, you feel the fire in the belly when the gods are about to, tell you to do something. It's not head-centered like our own culture. In any case, the persona is Jung's name for the mask we wear the role we play. And we all do that. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's perfectly natural. And you do it, don't you? So what role am I playing right now? Teacher. So to put a fancy term on it, I would say I've got my professorial persona on, right? Which I do. And what persona are you acting out right now? Obviously, right? You're playing the student role. So you're being nice and quiet and attentive and respectful, because I know you want good grades, and you're respecting me as your guest lecturer, and that's fabulous. But when you leave the school, right, you're going to play a different role and hang out with your friends and be one way. And then I'm assuming you have a home to go to, when you go home and hang out with your parents, you're going to play the role of their child, right? So throughout the day and throughout our lives, we adopt different masks, different roles, depending on the situation, and that's normally not a problem. It is fraught with dangers. Some people can't take the mask off. You know, I would set myself up for some real difficulties if I went home and lectured my girlfriend all the time, if I kept my professorial persona on, which I've been called on a number of times, right? And I've had to learn to take the professor mask off, just be a friend, right? Okay. Behind the ego, and I don't have it on the board, but this would be the beginning of the unconscious for Jung, right, is the archetype, by which he means a universal type of human experience. That's what an archetype is, a universal type of human experience. And an archetype is also a force which brings about that experience in the life of the individual or the group. So archetypes are universal types of human experience, but they are also, for Jung, forces in the psyche that are bringing about those experiences. For the sake of what? Growth, evolution, self-actualization, a higher quality life. Okay. So behind ego consciousness, in the first layer of the unconscious for Jung, is what Jung calls the shadow, and that's our dark side. Does anybody here not have a dark side? Right. So you think. People who think they don't have a dark side are, of course, deceiving themselves. And I thank you for your irony, right? I can guarantee that if you are unfortunate enough to end up in Afghanistan or Iraq, as my generation was in Vietnam, if you end up in a war zone, you will discover that you have a dark side, which is the equivalent of a monster. American troops are capable of monstrous acts, but that's true of all troops in all wars. Okay? All right, so the shadow is your dark side. It's what you don't show other people, or you try not to show other people. We usually keep it in the closet. Now, where I'm headed with this is the Theseus myth. When he goes down into the labyrinth is a symbol of the psyche, the many different paths and chambers of the unconscious. So Theseus going down into the labyrinth is an archetypal myth of the hero going into the cave in order to discover aspects about himself and become conscious of them, struggle with them, and integrate them into his sort of new, more highly evolved personality. Okay. So when Theseus goes into the labyrinth, he's going to confront his shadow, and what's the symbol of the shadow in that myth? Thank you, the Minotaur. Theseus struggling with the Minotaur is facing his own shadow, and he has the courage to do that. Theseus kills the Minotaur, but we ought not to take stories, myths, literally. For you and I, the idea is not to kill our dark side, but to realize that the shadow is that suppressed or repressed part of us that has taken psychic energy, libidinous energy, the energy of the psyche, and it's all knotted up. It's all knotted up. It's not available for creative purposes. So to do battle with the Minotaur or the shadow is to unravel those knots and turn that negative energy to release it into something positive. As Plato would say, so that you can give birth to beauty in time. That's Plato's definition of love. Love is giving birth to beauty in time. Okay? Now, Jung says behind the shadow is an archetype which is female and male. A Tao sign would work here. You know the Tao sign? What's another name for the Tao sign? The Yin Yang sign? You're familiar with Yin Yang, right? The circle with the S curve down the middle. One side's dark, one side's bright. Okay? For Jung, you're not a man or a woman first, you're a human being first. And all human beings, if you draw a circle, have a masculine side and a feminine side. The problem with most cultures, the problem with being socialized into being a woman and so acting a certain way, or being socialized into being a man in Western culture, macho man, not allowed to cry, right? We're out of touch with our feelings. And that's one of the reasons that we're so violent. And that, in fact, capitalism and Western culture in general are destroying Mother Earth. Because we're out of touch with the female, the mother side of ourselves. Because we've been socialized, conditioned, brainwashed into being macho men warriors. And that's related to Achilles, the hero archetype that just acts out his violence, right? Without thinking about it too much. And the consequences will be devastating, as the Earth is now, because we are committing collective environmental suicide. There is no question about that. And sometimes scientists even say that we're past the tipping point, that we're in for ecological apocalypse. And there was no reason for it, except that Western culture, capitalism in general, the worship of profit over human dignity, right, has allowed us to treat women and the earth as instruments for our profit.
On the subject
You want
of Achilles,
yes.
maybe this is a good time to point out. Does anybody know the story of Achilles? What choice was given to him early in his life? Does anybody remember that story? He had like a choice. He had like his path went in two ways. He could either be a great warrior, the greatest of all warriors, a living legend as a warrior, but have a short life, or he could live a long life, but have no special reputation as a warrior. So that was his basic choice. And what Professor Schindler pointed out to me is that when Odysseus goes down into the underworld and talks to the ghosts, he talks to his mother and he talks to Tiresias. He gets information down in the underworld. That's part of his hero's journey. He talks to Achilles, the ghost of Achilles. And Achilles, the guy who before said, yes, I want to be a great warrior. I don't care if I'm only going to live to be 30 years old or however old it was. I'd rather be, I'd rather have greatness. I'd rather live in my reputation than actually exist. But in the underworld, when he's a shadow, then he's full of complaint and longing and sadness, and says, I'd go back to the earth. I'd go back to life for anything. I'd be a menial slave. I'd rather be the least of people, but alive, than to be what I am. So that's an interesting commentary on the way of life of Achilles.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Carl. So just to pick up on what Carl was saying, and I know I'm juggling about 4 or 5 ideas at the same time, so just bear with me, right? Achilles has been socialized by ancient Greek culture to value the life of the warrior above all. There's nothing more valuable for the Greek male than to be a heroic warrior. And Achilles is the perfect example of that. So as Carl said, when he's given the choice to go to Troy and kill Hector, after which he himself will die, but he will be, famous as a hero, and songs will be sung about him, or he can avoid the conflict with Hector, return successfully to his home, and live a long and peaceful life, but not be famous. He chooses fame, he chooses glory, and he chooses death, right? Then when we move from the Iliad to the Odyssey, Odysseus, at one point, must go down into the underworld to consult the wise man Tiresias and to discover his mother down there. And he gets to wander around down in Hades, the underworld, right, where the people who have died, that's where their souls are hanging out. And he meets a variety of figures down there. And one of them that Odysseus meets is Achilles in Hades, in the underworld. And Odysseus says to Achilles, "You must be the happiest soul in Hades. You have songs sung about you. You are the greatest hero of Greek culture for your exploits during the Trojan War. Aren't you ecstatic? This is what you wanted. This is what you died for. You will be eternally famous. Professors and high school students will be talking about you 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years from now. That's eternal fame. That's ultimate glory. So you're happy, right?" And Achilles says, "Absolutely not. I'm miserable. I would rather be, as Carl said, a slave to the poorest peasant, but alive back on earth, than a hero for whom with songs sung about them and eternal fame." So, the Odyssey contains this profound twist, raises the question, and ironically, Achilles, the greatest of all heroes, or one of the greatest, is the one who reminds us that life is precious, and that war and violence ends in death, and see, the gods agree. Right? The gods agree. Life is precious. Don't throw it away. Okay? All right. So getting back to the Jungian map of the psyche, the anima, which just means the life force, as in what word? What English word does it remind you of immediately? It's the root of what word? Animal. Because animals, why do we call them that? Because they're alive. Right? So anima is the life force. Also, animated cartoons are the ones that jump around, right? As opposed to a comic book. And when you're feeling vital and enthusiastic, as I am because the coffee's kicking in, right? One is animated, one is lively, okay? The anima is Jung's term for the female, and I've drawn the astrological sign of Venus here to symbolize that. The anima is the female force or power or archetype within the masculine psyche. So on the self-actualization journey of the male hero, the male hero has to encounter his shadow, and he has to encounter his feminine side. And he has to stop denying his shadow, accept the fact that he has a dark side, struggle with it, and rather than tame the Minotaur or kill the Minotaur, to tame the shadow and ride that energy and transform it into something positive. In that process, the male hero will get in touch with his female side called the anima and realize that he has been a one-sided individual, not a whole human being. And that to be a whole, fully self-actualized human being, like Jesus or Buddha or Gandhi, for example, he has to respect the woman inside himself. And and integrate that feminine voice and pay attention to his intuitions and his inspirations, and to allow himself to cry and to, be emotionally complete. That's when he becomes a whole human being. And the anima then, his female side, is the guide that leads him to his true self or soul. Okay? So these are archetypal stages on the path of self-actualization. Realizing that you're not your persona. So feel free to take the mask off and be naked and vulnerable, we might say. And recognize we have a dark side, struggle with it. Stop denying it. Get in touch with the female side. She is like the soul that leads you to your spirit, your true self. And for Jung, your true self is connected to the rest of the universe. And that's when you begin. It's not something separate. It's not a Newtonian separate atom. It's more like Einstein's relativity theory. Everything is related. Quantum physics. It's all interconnected and interdependent. That's why Jesus says, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, because what you do to others, you do to yourself.
So are you saying in some way that Achilles, the great warrior, to what degree does Achilles actually engage in this question of his own shadow? To what degree does he actually call into question his socialization as a warrior and actually achieve his true self? Is he a true hero, or is he just the
Socialized.
Yeah, the image of the ideal Greek strong man? Does he fulfill this journey, or is he only a sort of a stand-in for part of it?
I really should toss that question to you, but I guess once we're done, we can open this up for conversation. But I'll anticipate your answer. Hopefully you know the answer. Achilles is not a fully self-actualized hero. He's a petulant, explosive, vengeful warrior, right, who's only interested in fame and glory. And he will even sacrifice his fellow Greek soldiers. He asks his mother, the sea goddess Thetis, to go up to Zeus and turn the tide of battle so that the Trojans are winning by killing the Greeks, so that hopefully the Greek king Agamemnon will come to Achilles and say, come on, you have to join the battle, right? Because Achilles has left. He's been insulted. And like a immature kid, he goes off and sulks and refuses to help the Greeks win the war. And the Greeks are getting slaughtered. He's even asked Zeus, help the Trojans slaughter the Greeks until Agamemnon realizes how much he needs me. This is not a fully self-actualized warrior. He doesn't really struggle with his shadow. He never really comes in contact with his anima, right? Except after he's dead. And that's when he realizes that he should have been a tender, caring, compassionate human being. Yes?
Of course, there's this one scene that you're quite familiar with at the end of the Iliad when Achilles has defeated Hector. Hector is the great Trojan warrior. Achilles is the great Greek warrior. And one of the high points of the Iliad is the battle between them. And Achilles defeats Hector in battle, and then he takes his body and he drags it around the walls of Troy several times. But the god Apollo protects him. Desecrating the body was the final stage of this sort of domination, the complete domination in life and in death. But Apollo protects the body of Hector. Achilles takes it back to the Greek camp, and then Priam, the king of Troy, disguises himself and sneaks out at night and crosses the lines into the Greek camp and goes to the house of Achilles and says, please, can I have the body of my son back so that I can give him a burial, so that he can have, so that his soul can rest in peace. And at an earlier stage in the story, it could be that Achilles would have rejected the appeal. If Achilles hadn't himself experienced profound sadness, he would have said no. He said, forget it. I defeated him, I desecrated him, and that stands. But in the course of the story, his best friend, Patroclus, is killed. And so there's this intense sadness and mourning that Achilles does go through. And he makes that connection and says, Priam must feel for his son what I felt for Patroclus. So there is that one moment at the end of the Iliad when Achilles relents. And Achilles does something kind, something that isn't just for his own glory, but something that would benefit someone else. So there is even though he doesn't embody this idea, he reaches it in some, like a flicker of insight. But maybe we could turn to Odysseus and talk about Odysseus and his qualities, which are very different than Achilles. I know you have a wonderful thing about how they're sort of paired heroes. They're not identical. Because I think that everyone in the room is a little more familiar with Odysseus than they are with Achilles, as is true of most people.
This is one of the great virtues of team teaching, because Carl just made a superb point. I'm saying that Achilles is not a self-actualized hero, but at the end of the Iliad, when he feels empathy for King Priam, whose son Hector is lying there dead, and Priam's asking for his son, Achilles takes off his warrior persona, right? And gets in touch with the feminine side of him that allows him to empathize with the human being and what it means to be a mother or a father. And so he agrees to give Hector back to Priam. And that is, that's Achilles breaking through into the self-actualization process, not being attached to his hero persona only, but operating from the deeper depths of the psyche wherein we realize that we're all alike and we should have compassion.
So in a sense, that took more courage for
Yes.
him to do than killing 10 warriors on the battlefield.
Or 1,000 more, yes. Yeah. This was his moment of courage, right? So that's a superb point, and thank you, right? Achilles is not just a jerk, right? He's at the end of the Iliad. His humanity breaks through in this most marvelous way. Okay, so just to complete this real as fast as I can, the anima is the female side of the man. The animus, and I put the Mars sign from astrology here to signify the masculine, every woman has a masculine side. And Jung calls that your animus. And you will not be a full human being until you have faced your shadow, integrated it, tamed it, recognized it, assumed responsibility for it, and also have integrated, respected your contrasexual, your opposite sexual side. So the man has to respect the woman inside of him, and the woman has to respect the masculine force or archetype inside of her, and integrate it, and listen to it, and give respect to it. Right? That's all part of self-actualization. Right? And then, when you struggle with that, and the more and more you achieve that, then the more and more it is the case that the ego, the small personality, can fulfill the destiny that the soul has in mind for you. That's the Jungian idea, that the self brings you into the world and gives you an ego identity so that you can embark on the hero's journey that climaxes in asking, not what's in it for me, but as Socrates says, how can I make my soul happy? And the answer of the soul is, you can make me happy by being of service to others. As Achilles is at the very end of the Iliad, when he concedes to give Hector's body back to Priam. Not what's in it for me, but what can I do now for Priam? Yes? Make sense? Hopefully. I'm not getting much of it. Yes? Say yes. Yes. Thank you. You're alive. I'm not dreaming. Good. Okay. Yeah. Okay, just one other thing I want to introduce, and then I'm going to hand this back to Carl, and we'll see where the discussion goes from there. It's the notion of, if you want to write it on the board, projection. Actually, a lot of what I'm doing here is to introduce you not just to Jungian psychology, because it's, Jungian psychology and he's famous, but because there's a crucial concept called projection. And part of your heroic challenge, and I hope you come away from today's class willing to embrace this. This is the challenge, to recognize your projections when they happen and withdraw them. Jung calls it eating your projections. So here's how it works. Most people are not fully willing to admit how deep and tangled and powerful their dark side is. A lot of people even deny it, right? So to the extent that you are not in touch with your own shadow side, guess what you and I and most people do? And this is also true for groups and even nations. We project the shadow onto somebody else, and we call that other person evil, right? George Bush, right? George W. Bush, the evildoers, right? They're always out there. But it's not just Bush, right? It's our presidents, the military, our commanders, right? They're always convincing us that, oh, God blesses America, we're great, liberty and justice for all, right? And meanwhile, who's the enemy other? Who's the dark side? Well, it's Gaddafi in Libya, or it's Manuel Noriega in Panama, or it's Saddam Hussein in Iraq, or it's Osama. It's always somebody else, right? In my generation, it's the Vietnamese, so let's go bomb them. Come on, a peasant nation on the other side of the world is a threat to the greatest nuclear power ever? No. And yet we went to war because our leaders convinced us, rather than taking care of our own shadow at home, recognizing the genocide of the Indians and the slavery of the blacks and the way we treat women and the way we treat the poor and the children and the elderly. 40 million American children have no health insurance. That's not enlightened. That's obscene. We need to take care of business at home to be a model for the world. But the fundamental problem of America, and it's going on today, right, is this, now we're going to demonize Iran. Let's go to war with Iran. No, deal with our own demons here at home, you see? And then instead of perpetrating violence on others, if we stop doing that, they will have no reason to cause another 9/11, if you think about it. So it's a huge, huge problem. Yes.
Like, if you look at it in school, and you look at who are the people who are, who have not dealt with the shadow. If there are people, I don't know if there are in the school, who are bullies, who spend a lot of time, pushing other people around or making life rough for others, or, trying to demonstrate how strong and what mighty they are. Many times that type of inflicting violence on others comes from fear that they've never dealt with. And if you ever, you probably will never have the chance, but if you ever learned that bully's actual story, if anybody ever took the time to explain to you who that person was, how they got to be the way they are, you'd see that's called the shadow, where that came from, what qualities they haven't dealt with. And because they haven't dealt with them inside, then they're experiencing threat all over the place. They've got fear inside. They've got somebody in their life, maybe it was a father who abused them or something like that, who made them tremendously afraid. And now, because they have all that fear there, they will go around inflicting violence on others. The moment if it ever happens to that person, if it's ever their good fortune to see the source of it and to overcome that inside, then they no longer will have to go around, beating up on other people, because they've balanced it, they've gotten over it in themselves, and now they're another person. And so this kind of growth is something that Jung is talking about, and the integration of the shadow, and as opposed to the projection of the unintegrated shadow onto others. Once it's integrated, the projection stops. There's no motive to blame others, to find others so much of a threat, because you're basically at peace in your own nature. When you're in that state, you don't see threat everywhere you look. You just see how people are. You just deal with things as they are. You haven't got this sort of filter, one kind of filter or another. Projection is not to be able to see the world as it is. Projection is to always have your agenda broadcast into the world. Okay, we're going to take up. There would be different levels of social activity. You would have slaves all over the ancient world. You had slaves. You had slaves in Egypt. You had slaves in Babylon. You had slaves in Greece, in Rome. Every ancient culture had that. But then you had farmers, you had merchants, and you had warriors. And In some cultures, you also had another class above warrior. You had the priestly class. And the ancient Greeks really fought with that idea of whether there should be another priestly class above the warrior class. And there's this incident at the beginning of the Iliad that illustrates this problem about the warrior and the priestly classes. I think you could say with some confidence that that Troy was a much more complete, established culture. The Greeks arrive on the shores, and Troy at that moment is this huge city, and it has King Priam, and it has all of his sons, and it has their wives and their children, and it has its priests. But when the Greeks show up at Troy, they would usually, it was very harsh. They would kill the men, and the women they would take as prizes. And what happens is that the leader of the Greeks, King Agamemnon, has taken Chryses as a war prize. And it happens that Chryses is the daughter of a priest of Apollo. And when her father, Chryseis, comes to ransom his daughter, he brings with him a chest full of gold. And he comes to Agamemnon and he says, please, I am a priest of Apollo. I'm not a warrior. I'm not a fighter. I don't have a sword and a shield, and I'm not out on the battlefield. I'm not trying to kill you. We're involved with other business. We have a higher calling. So here, please, take this gold. It isn't that he came and just insisted on as a matter of moral principle. He also had something to offer. Give me my daughter back, take the gold, everything will be fine. And Agamemnon, exemplifying that same warrior idea, not really willing to recognize that there is a thing called a priest, not really willing to say that. Agamemnon doesn't just say no, but boots him out of his camp. It kicks him out and says, get lost. And so the priest prays to Apollo and says, this great injustice has been done. Vengeance should be brought down upon the Greeks. This is not right. So Apollo listens to the prayers of the priest, and the death starts to come. And guess, how does the death come to the Greek camp? Have anybody ever looked at this text? It's kind of fascinating. It starts to come. And it starts first with the animals. The horses, the dogs, the animals associated with the camp, they start to die. And then the people start to die. And if you look, so those of you who are interested in biology and interested in modern science, you'll notice that there is a lot of interaction between the diseases that animals either have or carry and the diseases that human beings suffer from. You know, you have things like the swine flu or the avian flu, various kinds of interactions between animals and people. So at any rate, once the people start to die, Agamemnon has a change of heart and says, all right, well, okay, we're going to have to do something about this. So he gives the daughter back. He says, okay, fine, I'll give her back. And then he marches over and takes Achilles' war prize, another girl, and that starts this whole conflict within the Greek camp, which is the content of the Iliad. But I just wanted to point out that the whole culture was fixated on physical prowess, as in the sort of Bronze Age of Greece. That was number one. And there was a question about that Homer records for us. Was there something higher than physical strength?
Thank you, Carl. Just to pick up on one point, compensation. What is a bully? What makes a person a bully? Why is a bully a bully? You know, it's a major topic in American schools these days. A bully is a person who feels inferior inside, and in order to compensate for that feeling of inferiority, pretends to be superior, right? So another psychological notion besides projection is compensation. And in fact, projection, like bullying, is compensating for the unconscious aspects of yourself and acting out these archetypal feelings. So a bully is simply a person who feels inferior, compensates for it by acting superior, and then proves his or her superiority by bullying and beating up on others. Or, if you're president, launching a war against nations that, right? If you're as pathologically inferior and neurotic as George W. Bush, you're going to go to war against somebody else. Say, I'm a macho warrior. I'm a hero like Achilles. And he's just compensating, right, for the fact that deep down inside, he subconsciously knows he shouldn't even be president, right? It's compensation. Well, that's just an example. Okay, so I'm going to try and finish this up real quick. But you want to jump in here?
No. I was interested also in moving to Odysseus.
Yes.
His nature, because he has so many beautiful qualities and so many amazing stories associated with him. And we've reviewed a few of his situations. So if we get those into our discussion, I think people will be able to ask more questions.
Let me throw a little Odysseus in right now before I go back to Jung and complete it and then open it up, all right? When Odysseus meets the Cyclops has his cave that's his home. Odysseus goes into the cave. And finally, in order to escape, Odysseus has to blind the Cyclops. The Cyclops is like the Minotaur. It's a symbol of the shadow. And the Cyclops being one-eyed, what is the dark side of Odysseus at this particular phase after the Trojan War? He's still narrow-minded. He's still in the mind frame of being a warrior, right? So when he's blinding the Cyclops, he's actually, like Theseus dealing with the Minotaur in the labyrinth, he's now dealing with the monster in the cave. And that's symbolic.
Point out that that's a wonderful opportunity. We're talking about Odysseus and the Cyclops, a story that everybody knows. And we've just heard a reading of this myth, or not the myth, but of this episode. And that's a great thing that some of you could take and look back at it, retell the story, and come up with another version. If you see something else going on in that cave with the Cyclops and with Odysseus, find it out, write it down, hand it in, and you get an A+. That's, I just wanted to point out the practicalities.
Good, right. You see the parallel between the Minotaur and the Cyclops? They're both symbols of the shadow. And the hero's journey is you got to face your shadow and do battle with it. Okay? All right. So look, let's talk about romance. Want to talk about romance? Want to talk about falling in love? Here's how it works according to Jung. This is a lesson for a lifetime. If you pay close attention to what I'm now going to show you based on what we've already done, you can save yourself a lot of pain. It's up to you. Here's how it goes. Right? Because if you understand, then you can control. But if you don't understand, you have to live through the tragic consequences to awaken the understanding. So here's what happens, according to Jung, when we fall in love. And I'm just going to keep it simple for the sake of time and talk about a man and a woman falling in love. Okay, gay, bisexual, transgender relationships. It all gets very complicated. We don't have time to do that, so let's just keep it simple, okay? So the man sees a woman, he's attracted to her. He puts on his best persona, his best behavior, his best clothes, his best language, whatever he thinks is going to get her interested in him. If she's attracted to the man, she puts on her best clothes, the best perfume, the best lipstick. She acts in all the ways that she wants him to be attracted to her. So each of them, right, at the beginning stages of a romance, you put on your best persona. Now, you know from living with your parents, after you've lived for a while together, you don't care about the persona. You wake up in the morning looking like hell, and you don't care, right? But at the beginning stages, we put on this persona to attract the other person. Nothing wrong with that, says Jung, perfectly natural. And let's say you start to fall in love, and that you do fall in love, and that you do have a relationship, and you make a commitment to each other. The foundation for that relationship, says Jung, is that the man is projecting his anima unconsciously, the man is projecting his anima onto the woman, and that's his ideal image of the woman. Because from his whole life, he's been socialized to think from his mother and from advertising and TV and movies what the ideal woman is, and he projects that ideal onto the woman and then falls in love with what? His projection. This is in psychology is also called the halo effect. To project is to cast a halo, either positive or negative, around somebody else, and then to respond to the halo rather than to the actual person or the group. Okay? So the man projects his ideal anima onto the woman and then falls in love unconsciously with his own idealized image of her. The woman is doing exactly the same thing. She's projecting her animus, her idealized version of the man. Oh, he's going to be my knight in shining armor who's going to rescue me from all my troubles and always be there for me and be faithful and be kind. Well, you're setting yourself up, ladies, for a big disappointment. Right? Just like men, if you think, oh, I finally found the woman, now I'll be happy for the rest of my life. She'll satisfy all my desires and be kind and cook for me and do whatever I need, Then what happens? And some of you have already experienced this, and you definitely will experience it again. The woman cannot live up to these ideal expectations because she's just as messed up as he is. Right? And eventually, he starts to get disappointed in her. I said, well, how come you're not as sweet and kind and loving as... What happened to the lady I fell in love with? Well, you never fell in love with the lady. You fell in love with your expectations, the halo. Meanwhile, she's idealized him, and he turns out not to be such a knight in shining armor after all. He's got a shadow side. He can be selfish. He can be a bully. He can be disrespectful. And she's wondering, where's my knight in shining armor that I fell in love with? Right? Now, as each person becomes more and more disappointed with the other, what happens? Anybody want to guess? You project the shadow onto the woman, the man, right? And now the man's calling her, psycho bitch from hell. Not my queen, my princess, right? And she's saying something in reverse, right? You bastard, how dare you? Right? I don't teach here, so I can go over the limb with this language, right? And I know you use these words anyway, so come on, let's be real, right? So this is how relationships work. First you project the anima and the animus, then because it's impossible for the man and the woman to live up to the ideal, each gets disappointed, angrier and angrier, and then you project the shadow. So now instead of a positive halo, it's a negative halo. And you're cursing at each other and throwing things at each other, and sometimes worse. We have prisons full of people who have killed their lovers in crimes of passion. Right? Now, do you want to jump in?
I just wanted to...
I mean,
I think I finally got everybody's attention. Anyway, go ahead.
I mean, in the midst of this engaging narrative, I just wanted to point out that you said along the way, you said the two people meet and they fall in love and all that. And then you said, and they make a commitment. And that little moment that he said that illustrates a topic that if you wanted to talk about this kind of thing at length, you could be illustrated at, this is something that I picked up from a Danish philosopher named Kierkegaard, but he says that relationships have an aesthetic dimension, which is all about how it looks, the appeal. And then they have an ethical dimension, which is all about doing the right thing. And if a relationship can make a transition from the aesthetic, from the courtship, to the ethical, then it has the basis for a lifelong partnership. If it gets trapped in the aesthetic, then this dynamic that Professor Schindler has just gone through, that's all there is projection of either positive or negative, and either you're having your needs met or not, and it's just all about, it's in a way, the aesthetic is selfish, because it's beautiful to whom? To you. It's what you want. The ethical is other-centered. Ethical, I know my ethical duty not because I know what I want. I know my ethical duty because I know what's right for others. So when you said, and they make a commitment, I thought you raised this point of a distinction. And if you can get to this ethical dimension, then the sort of hell of relationship, horror, I think can be overcome. I just wanted to offer that.
And it can be overcome, because every relationship eventually has its storms. And some relationships don't survive the storms. But if the two individuals in the midst of the storm can realize it's not all the other person's fault. When you say it's your fault, you've got three fingers pointing back at you. It's not all the, yeah, so do it that way, right? But, a single finger, right? I should just add, in terms of Kierkegaard, which is later on for your careers, but maybe Carl will pick up on it, there's a third stage that Kierkegaard calls the spiritual. So Kierkegaard's notion of the self-actualizing journey is for each of us to move from the aesthetic to the ethical to the spiritual. Just, that's the hero's journey.
I'll put it in there just to make sure
In the future.
that it's there. So that we don't become absorbed. I mean, our cultural shadow is to get absorbed in these kind of questions.
Yes.
And there is this thing that needs to be honored. So thank you.
Yes. Okay, so we're in the midst of we've fallen in love. Now we're disappointed. First we projected the anima animus. The person cannot live up to the ideal. Each person's now disappointed. That's a setup to project the shadow. You bitch, you bastard, I hate you, etc. But if you get through the storm, right? I mean, since we have Plato on the board, Plato is famous for making the distinction between appearance and reality. And the task of philosophers is to penetrate appearance and get to the reality. Well, that's what's happening here. As the anima animus image has been shattered, and then you finally project the shadow, and then you realize, well, wait a minute, it's not all your fault. I set myself up for this. Then you release the projections. You withdraw or eat the projections. And now instead of perceiving the appearance, you are perceiving the reality of the person in their wholeness. And the man accepts that the female has a shadow side. She's not perfect. I'll help you with that. And the woman realizes you're not, a total warrior, hero. You have a shadow side. I'll help you with that. We need to communicate. We need to be patient. We need to work together. And that's when the relationship moves from puppy love to real love. Right? And many relationships do, even though most have to break up. And then your next relationship is going to be a test of what you learned. Are you going to project again and go through this whole cycle? You might, right? And you'll go through it until what? Until you finally learn the lessons and stop doing it. Just like life, right? You keep making the same mistakes and run into the same pain until you finally realize there's another way, right? You learn the lesson. And so what happens then is that the man realizes that through the relationship, the romance, the love, and Jung says this is the function of love. It sets us up for self-discovery. Through my projections onto the woman, first positive, then negative, I get in touch with my shadow side. And she's teaching me to get in touch with my feminine side. He's teaching her to get in touch with her masculine side and her shadow. So a romance is the opportunity for self-discovery and self-actualization if you can withdraw the projections and become conscious of what was formerly unconscious, right? Until you finally have a conscious working relationship with your higher self or your soul, and you're totally committed to making your soul happy. And that means treating others with love, compassion, and respect, as Jesus, Buddha, Gandhi, Martin Luther King, all the great teachers have taught. Yes? And it takes a hero to learn those lessons and to stay with it. Most people just want to flee into the Super Bowl and advertising and sports and NASCAR and fashion and whatever's on the news. Get out of Plato's cave. Unplug from the matrix. Kill your TV. right? I dare you to actually do some meditation. You think you're in control of your life? Well, are you in control of your brain? Do meditation for 15 minutes. You can't. I know what your brain is like. It's like a chipmunk on acid. It's constantly jumping around. And until you can quiet your monkey mind, you won't be able to sink down into yourself and discover these forces that are the truth about you. Okay? So, the function of mythology is to write out in big letters, in dramatic stories, the hero's journey that each of us is obliged to engage in order to be true to ourselves, right? And just like the Arthurian knight, goes out and has to battle the dragon, that's the shadow. In order to rescue whom? The princess. That's his anima. In order to bring the princess back to the kingdom, marry her, that's a mature relationship after you've gone through the stormy parts. You see how it all fits? Say yes. Yes. Thank you. Okay, Carl.
So I have a question.
Okay.
We've talked about the hero active out in the world, and we've talked about myth. Is there a heroic way of reading myth? Can myth be studied in such a way that some of these discoveries can happen through the actual working with the materials of myth?
I would say definitely yes. And one of the virtues of education, and not all people get an education, and I hope you get to college, because even in America, more and more people can no longer afford it, right? The oil companies are making billions. The pharmaceutical companies are making billions. Wall Street's making billions, right? But middle class, poor people, it's like more and more we can't afford education. And even to go to college, now you have to borrow $40 or $50 or $60,000 from the banks, right? It's. My point simply is this. One of the great virtues of being, in an educational environment is that you get turned on to stories, narratives, novels, myths. And to answer Carl's question, rather than having to work all this out in relationships and all the pain, right? If you are a reader, you can see this all worked out on the page and in your imagination as you follow the story, and you can learn these lessons so that you don't simply act them out and experience all the pain. So that's one of the great virtues of myths and all kinds of literature, whether it's poetry or novels or short stories, right? They themselves are a form of education if you learn how to read them. So the mistakes that the characters make, you don't have to make. If you learn from it, you don't have to be that character. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does, because in a way, what those people who have studied ancient languages, who study Latin and study Greek, in a way we're aiming at a kind of heroic reading, a kind of reading that's at a level of depth that's beyond what you would get from just a translation. So maybe this is just an imaginary ideal, but we're saying that if you look at these texts in the original, you will find something there that is a direct connection with the ancient world, with its sort of, the thousands of years that have passed, that these texts have been passed on. You can connect with the essence of that tradition when you study something in its depth. So I wanted to make a plug for heroic reading, which is what we're training to do here.
And I just have one more comment, and then I'm going to give it to Carl and open it up for discussion. The Odyssey is the journey of Odysseus. And what's he trying to do? He's trying to get from Troy, the battlefield, home to his wife Penelope. And it takes 10 years. But that Odyssean journey, the journey home, is symbolic of the journey of the ego to your true self, your soul. And to the extent that Odysseus, he loses his crew, he goes through all kinds of pain, he has to deal with sorceresses, he has to go to the underworld, he has all these different adventures, right? In in order to, he's stripped of all his comfort zone and all his crutches so that he comes face to face with who he really is, so that he can finally come back to his wife Penelope and treat her like like a, you know, a real woman who deserves to be respected. And the whole point is the Odyssey can be read as the hero's journey to self-actualization, so that Odysseus, the ego personality, comes to respect that to be a human being is to be embarked upon a heroic journey of self-actualization. And that's what the Odyssey is. It's all about homecoming. And who are you and I coming home to? We're coming home to the self or soul that grew you in the womb. That's genius. That's amazing creativity. Most of us take it for granted. But to stop taking it for granted and just doing what our culture tells us, but unplug from the matrix, get out of Plato's cave, and engage in the heroic struggle to discover who you are, why you're here, and then commit to fulfilling your destiny. That's the real hero's journey.
So in a sense, the one who never sheds the socialization isn't really in a position to help society from an authentic standpoint. They're only just going to be repeating back to society what society already knew. The person who goes through this process and finds this thing, he said, he made a link between genius and, you know, the seed, genetics. That's the same word root. So you find, genius is by finding the thing that's born in you, the thing that you always were from the moment that you came into the world. If you connect with that, that's genius. It isn't an IQ test. It's a measure of authenticity. So anyway, it's time for you to ask your questions. So think about it. Think about your questions.
You'll notice that we have talked about Theseus, Achilles, and Odysseus, right? We managed to get all three in, and we also gave you a pretty good sketch of Jungian psychology. We've warned you to watch out for projection. We've summarized the dynamics of romance. And now it's up to you how much you want to learn from that and take with you. This is Dean.
Hello.
Hey, Dean.
I'm
Hey.
Dean. My question is, we're talking about self-actualization, and you're talking about I heard you say it a couple times, stepping out of Plato's cave. Is that some sort of like existentialist type of feel? Like, because I know Plato has that very like, is that what you were getting? Like, is that what you mean exactly? I don't know. I just want to make sure.
Yes. Have you seen the movie The Matrix?
Yeah.
All right. If you haven't, see it. Not the two sequels. The original movie, simply The Matrix. That whole movie is based on Plato's cave. The Matrix is simply a modern term for Plato's cave. And what's happening in Plato's cave? The prisoners are trapped there, and they spend their whole lives watching shadows on a wall and engaged in guessing games. And they mistake shadows for reality. They don't even know they're in a cave. They don't even know there's a real world outside the cave. They're so enraptured by the shadows, right? And Socrates is the hero who tries to unchain them and say, let's go on the hero's journey. Stop obsessing on the shadows on the wall. Plato was a prophet. 2,400 years ago, he described most Americans coming home from work or school sitting on their ass watching TV. Whether it's American Idol or Wheel of Fortune or the Super, right? Instead of turn off the TV, get out of Plato's cave, unplug from the Matrix like Neo does, right? And then you can be a hero and be of service to your country that desperately needs for you to do that, because your country wants to keep you in the cave. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. Good. And it is highly existential.
Yeah.
Because the main theme of existentialism is authenticity. To be an authentic individual rather than simply a socialized puppet, a socialized robot doing what everybody else does and believing whatever you're told on the news. Like, oh, we got to go to work. No. Pardon my Swahili. This is Kathy. Hi, Kathy.
Hi. I had a question about the animus and the whole concept of it. As a girl, I find it a little bit difficult to understand, like, exactly what an animus rather than the anima entails.
Well, as a woman, a lady,
Yeah,
a girl,
I am.
you have a masculine archetypal force inside your psyche, which, when you fall in love, you will have a natural tendency to project onto your boyfriend or lover, right? And that's your animus. You will project your animus, which is your ideal image of what a man should be. So who are you going to fall in love with? Some guy who, as much as possible, approximates your ideal, right? The ideal boyfriend, right? I mean, none of us goes down around trying to fall in love with, somebody who's a total jerk. They have to live up to your, right? So, yes.
But wouldn't that projection be the results of socialization?
Yes, it would. Yes, A++.
I thought that was bad.
Socialization, well, it's bad in the sense that you're projecting a socialized, idealized image onto somebody, which prevents you from seeing that person for who they really are. In that sense, yes, it is bad. Right? But it's also good in the sense that projection sets us up to learn the lessons we need to learn. Right? So projection's not all bad. Let me just add this one point about recognizing the shadow and eating it. When you fall in love and then the romance starts to break up and you start cursing at each other and swearing at each other and and the woman says it's your fault and the man says no, it's your fault, right? When you fall in love with somebody, all along the way there's little yellow flags, red flags saying danger zone, danger zone. And what do? You do what I did. You ignore the danger signs and believe what you want to believe, see what you want to see, fall in love with the person, convince yourself that it's all going to be great, and now you're set up for the storm, right? Okay.
And you can also, if you want, you can start to look at those two words, anima and animus, and see whether they actually are identical. There's something interesting to find out about those words. If you look at them as Latin words, they aren't entirely symmetrical. It's not just the masculine, feminine form of the same thing. There's a slight difference. Questions? What do you need to know? Don't be nervous. No, hold on.
Give it away.
Questions? What do you want to ask? All right, team. Your follow-up.
Concerning the anima and animus, if that's the case, if that moment of mistake where you're putting forth the anima onto someone else and you're hoping to, you're convincing yourself that is what you're falling in love with, wouldn't it be safe to say that if you could exclude that completely, if you were to somehow break that down, then you could have no learning curve whatsoever? You could just... Is it possible? I believe it would be possible to avoid that completely. It's inevitable that we fail.
No, it's not. No, it's definitely not. I mean, I know relationships that succeed, and I admire them greatly. But that's because they learn from the storms, and they assume responsibility. It's a mutual responsibility, and they don't just accuse each other, right? But we both set ourselves up for this, and now we have a stormy period, and let's look at why we're so upset, and if we're honest, we will agree that we're both at fault, and we can learn from this and not make the same mistake. So now let's move forward as more enlightened, more authentic individuals, and the relationship will be stronger. Absolutely. Yeah, my twin brother's got a relationship like that. Louis and Meg have a relationship like that at the Peace Abbey, So.
Anyway, I think at this point we better wrap it up. So let's give Professor Schindler a round of applause. Thank you.